Hi there, everyone, and welcome to this auditing webinar on preliminary engagement activities brought to you by CA Quadrants Academy and Training. My name is Masoom Ali, and I will be hosting this webinar. I'd like to start off with a motivational quote, and this is just so that we begin with the right mindset. See, a positive mindset can make a huge difference in your life, not just your academic life, but in just about every other aspect as well. And if you are doing this course, I know exactly how draining and tiring the entire journey can get. I know you feel like just giving up at days, and it's there are days when your motivation levels really get down. I've done this course myself. I still remember those dark days, how demotivated you feel, how overwhelmed you feel. So, a positive mindset is actually very important to make sure that you overcome this and that you stay on track, stay focused, keep working hard, even though, the outcome looks very grim. So I've included a quote here which reads as follows: there will be obstacles, there will be doubters, there will be mistakes, but with hard work, there are no limits. And then this was by Michael Phelps. I think we all know who Michael Phelps is. If you do not know who Michael Phelps is, do yourself a favor, go into a Google search on the man. Right, and you can take a lot of wisdom out of this quote, right? There will be obstacles, there will be doubters, there will be mistakes, but with hard work, there are no limits. And this is something which really, it's very applicable to your CTA studies, as far as I'm concerned, because we all experience obstacles, whether financial, whether social, or maybe it's work problems at home, etc., etc. There will be doubters as well. And look, I can tell you now, there were a lot of doubters when I did this course. You get a lot of people asking you, why are you doing it? Some people feel, even before you've studied it, you're in first year, and already people are just asking you, why are you doing it? Just on the basis of how difficult it is and how many people have failed in the past. So you haven't even failed, but already people are doubting. There will be mistakes. We've all made plenty of mistakes. I'm very sure that you've gotten either most or all of your test one results by now. So some of you would be happy with how it went. Some of you would be unhappy with how it went. A lot of you would be shocked. Those are very, very, very normal reactions to be having. But with hard work, there are no limits. And that is very, very true. As long as you keep on pushing, as long as you keep on believing that you can do it, there are no limits. There's no reason why you cannot pass. Everybody that has passed at the end of the year did not have it, going smooth sailing from start to finish. I can promise you that. So it's not like in order to be successful at the end of the day, everything has to go your way. Another quotation which I've really liked is, it's not about how you start, it's about how you finish. So as important as it is to have a good start, you need to make sure that you finish strong as well. So don't let the start which you have influence your the way you finish in a bad way. Okay. Right. So moving on to the agenda for this webinar, you will see that we have a couple of things lined up for our session. So I hope that you are watching this while you are quite fresh and can pay attention to the details which we will be covering. Right. You will be able to watch this webinar a couple of times. It's not a once-off type of thing. I've set it up in that way because I kind of do understand and can appreciate that it's not, you look at it once and then it's finished. You do need to kind of view something, on a repetitive basis to really, really get the nitty-gritty. So you will be able to watch this again, but just make sure that you're doing it while you are fresh. Don't do it while you are drowsy or panicked or in a rush or whatever. This is a webinar. It's not a lecture which, if you don't watch it now and if you miss it now, it's gone or anything like that. Right? Okay, so before we get started, we have some administration matters to cover. Okay, and let's have a look at them. Right. Firstly, If you are experiencing any connection problems and you are unable to view this webinar, please contact us via email or via our Facebook page, and we will set up an alternative method for you to view the webinar. Now, you've paid for this, and we really want you to be able to access this webinar without any difficulty. So we therefore urge you to please get into contact with us if you are unable to view this webinar for any reason. If there are any sound issues or other technical difficulties which result in the webinar being unable to continue, we will either reschedule the webinar or send you a link to a recording of the webinar, which you can listen to in your own time. If you have any questions or queries, please contact us via email or via our Facebook page, and we will address these for you. Lastly, and very importantly, we are planning on hosting regular tutorial webinars for you guys. And these will be where we go through a question in a bit of detail and take you through the core principles which you need to be aware of and which you need to learn. What I have experienced and what I've noticed from my CCA studies, and even after my CCA studies when I'm helping other students, it's that students often go through a question and do a question for the sake of doing that question. And once they've completed that question, they feel that, okay, we've done a question on preliminary engagement activities or whatever, topic the question is addressing. And they feel that based on that, they are ready. And that's not the point of a question. The point of the question is to highlight principles and to test whether you can actually firstly pick up on those principles which are being examined, and if you can apply those principles in practice. Right. So we will go through, or we are planning on having webinars where we will actually focus on this. It's not about doing the question. You can do 100 questions. I promise you that's not what you are trying to do. It's not about volume. It's about what you're taking out from that question. Right. We don't have any of those webinars confirmed as yet, but if we do arrange for a tutorial webinar, then we will notify you via email as well as via our Facebook page. So if you haven't liked our Facebook page yet, please make sure that you do so, right? We are going to put up a lot of notifications on our Facebook page, and this is going to be the method which we use going forward, in addition to email, obviously. If you have like our Facebook page, then make sure that you check our page regularly for these notifications regarding any webinars which are available or any other promotions which we might have going on. We aren't always going to be sharing this to the groups. The reason for this is because, we don't want to be seen to be spamming on Facebook. And obviously, if I'm doing something where I've got one webinar a day that is coming out, I'm going to be having posts going to multiple groups, and we don't want the situation to get messy. So please make sure that you like the page. If you have not liked the page, then at least ask someone who has liked it, I guess, if there are any notifications which have been put up. But I suppose the easiest way would be just to like the page and to actually follow. We want to keep our page interactive, right? And that is very important for us. Okay. Looking at the specific outcomes of the section, we can see that there are two of them. Firstly, to learn how to discuss the preliminary engagement activities that you would perform before accepting a prospective client or an existing client. Okay, let me just fix that up. And secondly, to learn how to evaluate the audit work performed when accepting new clients by referring to ISQC 1, ISA 220, ISA 300, and the CPC. Okay, the study approach. Okay, you will see that we have outlined a suggested study approach which you can use when you are studying this section. Note again that this is a suggested study approach and that you should do whatever works for you. If you have your method and you are passing, then I don't think that you need to change this, or you don't need to change it drastically. Maybe you can just, try and incorporate some of these principles just to maybe improve on it. But if you are a bit confused as to where to begin studying this section and how to study this section, and you're quite overwhelmed by the theory, you don't have a starting point, then I think that you will find our suggested study approach quite helpful. Okay, so the first thing is learn the theory contained in your prescribed textbooks. Right, so you would have your prescribed textbooks. I'm not going to go through names, but there are theory in these, and it would be good for you to go through this and get familiar with it so that you have a starting point and that you have some foundation as well, right? So that you're not just starting from scratch. Secondly, make sure to study and understand the relevant legislation as contained in the ISAs. Okay, so you know that the ISAs are your main source of theory, and you need to make sure that you know which sections are relevant and that you highlight these sections, and I've gotten that in the next point as well, and that you also understand this theory. It's not just good enough to know where the theory is, but then you don't understand it. And this is often the case why many students fail. It's because they don't understand the theory. And when you don't understand the theory, then you don't know what is applicable and what is not applicable. And this is where you come across problems. And lastly, do questions to gain more exposure and practice the application of relevant principles. So see, this is where your questions are coming in. And notice that this is at the last, right? So you're not learning from your questions. Right, I've structured this in this way, and you can see questions are the last thing which you would be doing. I do understand that a lot of students, when they are strapped for time, then they go through questions and feel that okay, when they get a question like this is how they're going to answer it and so on. That's not the ideal way of doing it. It might work for you sometimes. I'm not saying that there have been no students in the history of accounting who have ever, seen some sort of success through this, but this isn't the method that you want to be doing, meaning that, following, just doing questions and relying on that. You need to know and understand the theory. Questions are just to gain more exposure and to practice your application. Right. Okay, now moving on, we will now look at the different ways in which this section can be asked in tests and exams. And I think that this will be a particularly relevant section for most of you, if not all of you. After all, it's nice to know what types of questions you can prepare for and what you should prepare for, because this does relieve you of some anxiety, right? So on the slide, you will find some of the more common ways in which this section can be examined. Note that these are just some of the more common ways that this section can be examined, and that there are probably still some other ways in which questions on the section can be set. Your goal is to know the principle well enough to be able to answer any question that you are given. So I've listed a few examples here, and as you will see, they are quite similar, right? The first one is discuss the matters that Auditor Limited should consider before or prior to accepting Client Limited as an audit client. This would be in a case of where a prospective client is available and now the auditor is determining should we accept them, shouldn't we? The second type of question, very similar to the first, but it's just that it'll be in the past tense, meaning they've already accepted the client, but now what should they have considered? And this it's not a hard and fast rule, but this sort of guides you into, indicating that there would be negative things to consider, but it's not necessarily that there are only negative things. There would be positive things as well. Compare that to the third question, which says discuss the concerns that Auditor Limited would have prior to accepting Client Limited as an audit client. So obviously, once you've seen concerns, you know for a fact that there is something wrong. And your ability to pick up on, identifiers or red flags of concerns will be tested here, right? And we will go through some of these, but this is what, where your theory really comes in. Discuss your concerns regarding the manner in which new audit clients are sourced by Auditor Limited. Such a question which would tell you that, look, this is how the auditor or the audit firm goes about procuring clients. And obviously, there would be more often than not something dodgy, or maybe dodgy is not the right word to use, but something which should be raising a red flag in the manner in which these guys are doing this. And lastly, discuss your concerns regarding the new client pre-acceptance questionnaire used by Auditor Limited when sourcing new clients. Okay, this is not a very common question, to be honest, but it is a question which you should have at the back of your mind. I have seen questions on this where there'd be a client pre-acceptance questionnaire which the auditor would use, and there would be questions or criteria on there which might not be in line with the ISAs, or which might raise a few red flags, right? So these are just some of the questions which you should be prepared for. Again, this is not a complete list, so don't look at it as, oh, wait, these are the only 5 types of questions which we can get on preliminary engagement activities. But I would suggest that you kind of keep these as a, guideline as to what types of questions you could get. Right, the relevant statements. Here you will see a list of statements which I consider to be relevant to the topic which we will be discussing in this webinar. Now, this does not mean that each entire statement is relevant to the topic, but it does mean that there are or may be certain sections within these statements which will pertain to the topic. And this is something which you need to be aware of when you are busy studying. You need to think of things in an integrated manner, and you want to make sure that you do not miss out on important details which you should have considered while you were studying. So try and make your theory as wide as possible, but also as relevant as possible. But there's always, a saying that used to go around when I was studying, that don't study in silos, meaning don't isolate your studies, right? The integration, especially at CTA level, is a very common thing. It links up to a lot of things. You will notice that yourself when you look at a memorandum from a question where you look at one particular standard or statement, and then you'd see that there are other standards and statements which do link up to it, which you might not have thought about. And it's important that you start training yourself to think in a broad sense, because these are easy marks which you are losing out on. So you don't want that. You really do not need to be putting yourself in that sort of position. It's detrimental to you. So please make sure that you do consider how every other standard could link up to what you are studying. Because I can promise you now, it's very unlikely that one thing is just going to have one standard or one statement and be isolated on its own. Okay, right. You will also notice that we make a lot of reference to the theory contained in the standards as we go through the webinar, right? And this is to help guide you to the theory which is relevant and which we feel that you should be highlighting. A big question which we've noticed students have is that they're not sure what they should highlight. You get some handbooks which are pretty much not highlighted at all, or there's very, very little highlighting to the point where the student shouldn't have just highlighted. And then you get some handbooks which almost everything is highlighted. And, you clearly see that, everything can't be irrelevant and everything can't be relevant also. So you need to be making sure that you're not highlighting for the sake of highlighting and that you are highlighting what is relevant. The ISAs do contain a lot of guidance, and you will find that auditing can become a lot easier if you know how to use the ISAs properly. So with that said, let's get started with the webinar. Okay. So preliminary engagement activities, skills, competence, and resources, right? So the firm shall establish policies and procedures for the acceptance and continuance of client relationships and specific engagements designed to provide the firm with reasonable assurance that it will only undertake or continue relationships and engagements where the firm is competent to perform the engagement and has the capabilities, including the time and resources to do so. And we've included the reference to the relevant ISA there for you. So what I want you to take away from this is that skills and competence are a big consideration when it comes to determining whether or not you should actually accept or continue a particular engagement. So looking at the acceptance part, say you have a new client or a prospective client, right? They're not your clients yet. Now, you at this point in time need to consider that, okay, hang on, do we as an audit firm have the skills, resources, capabilities, etc., necessary to service this client properly? And do we have the time in order to do this, as well as the resources in order to do this? Because if you don't, right, then essentially what are you doing? You aren't going to address their needs properly. It's a very high probability that you're going to produce substandard work. And lastly, the fallout from this is going to be quite detrimental to you as an auditor or to your audit firm, because think about what the CPC says, right? Under professional competence and due care. Do you really think that you would have been complying with that if you take on something which you know deep down you cannot do? So you need to think of these things. It's really, really, really important. It's really something which you need to consider. It's really something which, firms, have to take, I'd say, very seriously when it comes to actually accepting or declining client engagements, right? And it's not just new engagements, but also existing engagements. So that's why the continuance also comes in, because say you have an existing client, but now they've grown and they've grown to a point where you now cannot actually service them adequately, and definitely not in the way that you used to do before. Do you think that it would be responsible of you as the auditor to take on this engagement? I don't think so. And what level of work do you think, or what standard of work do you think you are going to produce? So it's something which you need to really, really consider. And often a guideline which you will see in questions would be where the question would say that you are a newly qualified CA, or you are recently registered with IRBA, or your firm is a small or medium-sized audit firm, and you'll notice that the client is quite big or quite complex, or the industry in which it is operating in is quite big or quite complex. So, that would sort of make you think that, okay, skills, competence, and resources, we might not actually have these covered in order to take on this. Or you might actually have it, but you need to consider, do we or don't we? Right? And that's the whole point. So preliminary engagement activities are not necessarily just negative things, right? It's anything that you would consider. right? Or it's taking into account these matters that you would consider. And obviously skills, competence, and resources are one of these. Then these points over here on this slide are some examples, right? This is not every single example of what you need to consider, but some examples of the things which you need to consider and under skills, competence, and resources. And you don't need to swat this list off. I mean, it's good if you do have, a background of this at the back of your mind. But it is necessary for you to do this. I would actually say that you need to have this covered. And at a very minimum, rather, you need to make sure that you've actually got this covered, I would say. Right. So it is necessary for you to make sure that you've done your homework on skill, competence, and resources insofar as these points are concerned at a minimum. But as you do questions, you will see that there are more and more considerations which you can actually come across and find out, right? But you don't need to swat these off. These are in ISQC1. So you just highlight this and go to that and you would find it, right? It's not a problem at all. It's not. And if you read through them, you'll see that it's a lot of common sense. It's experience, your knowledge, your competence, if you have access to experts, if you need them. Quality control is a very, very big issue, especially nowadays. You do need to make sure that you've got your quality control issues covered. You don't want to be losing, your credibility, and that because you've done work and the work isn't up to scratch, right? So you need to be considering all of these things. It is very, very important. And as I said, you will find them here in ISQC1, but you can do questions just to add to this. But again, see, now when you understand how to use your ISAs, it's not difficult. Look, you can find all of these there, what you need to consider. And you will see that there would be indicators in the question, in the information in the question, which would speak to some of these things. And this is what you should do during your reading time. But we'll discuss more of that under exam technique, right? So preliminary engagement activities, integrity of the clients, right? So obviously client's integrity is also extremely important, right? Because you do not want to take on a client which is doing unsavory business practices or which have a very poor reputation in the business world or in general. And I don't think that I need to touch too much on this. I think you guys can kind of, understand especially how relevant this is, especially now in South Africa with everything that's going on in the economy. If you have been paying attention to the news, which I hope you guys have been, you would understand that the integrity of the client which you take on, if that client lacks integrity, if that client is really one of those shady characters and they do not conduct business in an ethical manner, it can really, really, really impact you. So these, again, are indicators which you can consider, and that's where they are in ISQC1. You need to think of these things, right? You need to make sure that you've considered these things when looking at the integrity of the client. But not only the client, and this is another important, but the related parties, right? So the clients might be okay, they might not be unethical, but the related parties to this client might be doing a whole bunch of shady things which you really do not want to be a part of. And reputation counts a lot. And it takes years and years and years to build a reputation, but it takes one mistake to really have it come crashing down. And look, we all are human beings. We do make mistakes. So you would know in personal lives, you would have made a mistake here and there, but you do not want to be, as a professional or, even as a human being, compromising your integrity and associating yourself with someone who lacks integrity. So that is important. So you need to consider that. And these are considerations which will be, part of every client's acceptance decision, actually, not just an audit. And you would get information in the question which might talk to this. And one of the more common things would be where the client is aggressively concerned with maintaining its firm's fees as low as possible, or they maybe just have a habit of being difficult or very, have a autocratic management style or very dominant management style, that sort of thing. Or, they just, something doesn't feel right. And trust your gut instinct with this. Don't confine yourself to textbooks. Think of it as a human being, right? What would raise a red flag for you? Now you're sitting there, you're reading the question. What would give you a bit of a sleepless night, I guess, or make you feel a bit uncomfortable if you were taking on this client with regards to this client's integrity? What would make you say that, no, you know what? I think this client's, there's something not right with them. Those sort of things. So you need to really consider this. This is important. I know I'm sitting on this slide for a while, but it is important. Client integrity is not something which you mess around with. Okay. Now we look at our human resources, right? I'm not going to go through each of these things in huge detail, but these are human resources which you need to consider regarding the firm. These are under ISQC1. It's not things which are very foreign to you, right? I think that you do need to consider this when you are doing your acceptance decisions, to see whether you're actually going to have your human resources for the engagement, right? So that's where things like competence, recruitment could lead to, how do you procure staff? Because if your recruitment practices are poor, right? Say maybe you only work on, very inexperienced people. You really don't take experienced people on, or you only take people from a certain sector. And now you've got a client which is in a different sector to what your staff are usually accustomed to operating in. Then clearly you've got a human resource issue here when it comes to accepting this client. And it's not the best example, but it is, something which could make you think. So that's kind of like what you need to be thinking about. And again, these are included in ISQC1, right? And they are considerations which you do need to take into account, you do need to think about. Okay, achieving competence. This is more a solution to things. So this would be something which might not necessarily be tested in preliminary engagement activities, but it could be examples of solutions which you could give. Because remember, as an auditor, a lot of people think that auditors are just there to look for problems, but that's not the case, right? You, as a professional, definitely want to be part of the solution, right? So obviously now, if you do have a human resource issue, would you not want to resolve it? You don't want to just have this problem going on from one year to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. I mean, that just does not make sense now, does it? Because then, where are you going? Where are you headed? So these, again, are just some examples. So a question, might just be like a 5-mark question, or maybe a 3-mark question, something like, okay, the human resources are a problem, or skills and competence are a problem. How can Auditor Limited go about solving this? What are the solutions available to them? What type of, processes should they have in place? What should they do? Those sort of things. And it's good things to think about. I know that, that's why I say don't study in silos. Don't just limit your thinking. Try and be as broad with this as you possibly can. right? So this might not necessarily just be part of your preliminary engagement activity. You're not going to consider this, you're not going to go write in your question scripts the solution unless you ask. So you're not going to say that, we might not have sufficient staff, for example, and then start writing these 5 points. But if you are asked for, how could you improve the competence of your staff, well, then these are examples of ways in which you could do it. And again, you don't need to swat it off. It is in ISQC1. Okay, now preliminary engagement activities, information controls. So now this might be a big aha moment for many of you, because what is this now? I mean, suddenly information controls under preliminary engagement activities. Now, where did this come from? And it's not a common question that really gets asked, is it? Now, let us just read it, and then I'll explain exactly why I've included it here and why I think it's relevant. Some other people might not think it's relevant. I think it's good to know. I think you should be knowing it, and I will explain why once I've read the first paragraph over here. So, whether engagement documentation is in paper, electronic, or other media, the integrity, accessibility, or retrievability of the underlying data may be compromised if the documentation could be altered, added to, or deleted without the firm's knowledge, or if it could be permanently lost or damaged. Accordingly, controls that the firm designs and implements to avoid unauthorized alteration or loss of engagement documentation may include those that, and okay, well, we've got these 4 points. I'm not going to read each one of these out. But why is this relevant, right? And I would say that it's necessary to know these things because, firstly, as an audit firm, if you do not have these types of controls available or in place or implemented, you really need to be considering and asking yourself that, okay, hang on, am I protecting my clients and the integrity of their information? Because you are putting your clients' confidential information at risk, right? So if you have a very large client, now, do you want to arrive at a situation where their information is just being accessed by everyone and anyone? No, I really don't think so. So if you are an audit firm that doesn't have these sort of things in place, then should you be taking on a client? And you need to consider this because these are effectively weaknesses in your process. So a question might ask this, like this directly, that what information controls should the firm have in place? But these information controls will also be at the client because maybe the client doesn't have proper controls over the information. And this would be something which you should consider risky because their control environment is poor. So do you see how everything ties up? That's why I say don't study in silos because everything does have a link, does it not? I mean, you can use this information. If you have a client now, right? Let's relate it to the client. And the client does have or doesn't have any controls to prevent unauthorized changes to, instead of engagement documentation, say the master file, document information. Would you not consider that to be a big risk? Or if they have controls, but these controls are quite weak, would you not consider that to be a risk? Would that not be something which you want to consider? I think it would be. So these are something which might not make a direct difference to whether you accept the client or not, but nonetheless, I would say there are things which you need to consider as a firm because it speaks to your ability to service your client properly. Now, questions might not necessarily highlight these sort of things and say that, hey, Auditor Limited doesn't have proper controls over engagement documentation. But again, you do need to make sure that you do consider these. And again, you don't need to swat them off. You just need to know that these exist. Some of you might not even have known that these exist, but they do. And you will find them in ISQC1, right? So far, I hope that you are actually getting some value out of this webinar, hey? And that you're not, you know, finding this to be the same as every other lesson which you've received on preliminary engagement activities. I am trying to actually make this a bit more value added and to really give you some things to think about and to really encourage thinking and to broaden your sense of thinking. That is a big goal of mine. That is something which I am really, really, really big on. I emphasize that a lot. Any student which I have consulted will tell you that, right? And these are things which you need to consider. And look, these are not things which you need to swat off. So it's not like I'm giving you extra work to do, but I am trying to expand your thinking. And you need to be doing these things, right? Okay, so let's move on. Now, we've discussed other controls there, right? Now, obviously, these four things, right, if you read them, right, are more like solutions or the types of controls which you could implement, right? So again, I'm not going to go through them in detail. You can read them. You will have a copy of these slides, so that's fine. And again, they are in ISQC1. So these are just things which, if you are asked to actually what procedures you could have in place, what controls you could have in place, these would be there. And as I said, if you read your standards properly, you'll see that a lot of the answers are there. So, a lot of students get overwhelmed and wowed by, some questions which come in and they're like, oh my God, how did they ask this in preliminary engagement activities? I never thought they could ask something like that there. Or, I'm just using preliminary engagement activities as an example, but it's, in a lot of a lot of other topics as well. And I mean, I know I was a student myself. I used to ask myself this question sometimes because you'll just never see the link. But trust me, sitting on the other side, when you actually go through things in a lot more detail, you'll find that there actually are a lot of things which you overlook when you are studying. And that's why I say don't study in a hurry. You don't get your things done and you overcome a lot. You overlook a lot of things. I do understand that there is time pressure, but you need to also make sure that you cover the information, because if you rush through it, you haven't covered it adequately, pretty much comes to you not covering it at all. You write a test on it, you can't answer anything on it. So what have you achieved? And you really need to ask yourself the question, what have you achieved? Okay, so let's move on. Okay, preliminary engagement activities, preconditions for an audit. Okay, this is not something which you would necessarily be asked, right? But well, obviously, if you are, let me rephrase this, right? It's not something which you would be asked once you've already established that this is an audit engagement. But there could be instances where you are asked whether this is an audit engagement or not. Because remember, you can do other types of engagements as well. And these are the criteria, if I can use that, right? To sort of ascertain whether or not this firstly meets the requirements or the preconditions for an audit engagement to begin with. So this is just good to know. But obviously, if you know in the question that it is already an audit engagement, you don't need to still now go and test, oh, is this an audit engagement or is it not an audit engagement? And start going on, to evaluate it, and doing all of those funny things now where you're trying to, test this and start confusing as well. This again is before you actually have established whether it's an audit client or not. To be perfectly honest, it's not something which really would get tested in terms of once you've, in terms of pre-engagement activities, because you kind of already know that it is an audit in most cases, I'd say. But if there is some doubts, well, these are the criteria which you would look at to determine. And again, it's included in ISA 210 paragraph 6. So nothing that you need to swat off. Obviously, if you know it off by heart, you don't need to know it verbatim, but if you do know what the preconditions of an audit are, which would be good to know anyway as a professional, but again, they are in ISA 210. Okay. So preliminary engagement activities, responding to a request to change the terms of the audit agreement. So can you change the terms of an audit agreement? That's actually one of the questions I've gotten asked quite a bit, right? And yeah, you can. The client can ask you to do this, right? But there are conditions for it, right? And the first sentence in this whole thing says that, right? The auditor shall not agree to a change in the terms of the audit engagement where there is no reasonable justification for doing so. Okay, so there needs to be a reasonable justification to change the terms of the audit engagement, because look, normally what would happen is that it might move from an audit engagement to an agreed upon procedures engagement. And if this is the case, okay, there has to be a reason for this and why. So this is just, by the way, it's something that's good to know. You obviously wouldn't get this in a pre-engagement activity question per se, whereby you're evaluating all of this, but this is just my value add, right? And again, it's included in your ISAs. So these are, again, not things which I'm giving you which are new to swat off, right? Now, there are a few other things which you would notice, right? I haven't touched on, right? And these are, okay, I've touched on skills, competence, and resources. And there are some other things which you need to look at. And I've touched on the integrity of the client and management. But you also need to look at your CPC, right? Because you need to make sure that you are complying with the code of professional conduct and that you are not now in contravention of this code. There's no ethical, dilemmas or, instances where now your ethics are compromised by accepting this client. So ethics are also a huge consideration here, right? So the CPC, very relevant. So if you think that, okay, you've done it for a previous assessment, if it's, now you don't need to worry about it again, no, right? Ethics, and this is something which I will say, right? Whether or not ethics and the CPC are specifically tested in a section or in an assessment or not, you should always have this at the back of your mind. It is integrated. As far as I'm concerned, it's integrated. It's not a separate section which only comes in, for a certain test and then you don't worry about ethics ever again. No, you worry about ethics from start to finish. It is in every decision you make. It is throughout the performance of the audit. It is on conclusion of the audit. Ethics are there. They are relevant. Whether you're the auditor, whether you're the client, it is there. Right, so don't separate ethics. So your ethical considerations are important. So in case you are wondering, yes, you do need to know your CPC. Right, so if that and if that feels like extra studying, it actually really isn't, because these are common sense things. It's not really difficult. Remember, I touched on skills, competence, and resources, right? Now, does that not link up in some way to professional competence in the UK? Then think about the way, I remember one of the questions I said you could get asked is, your concerns regarding the way clients are sourced by the firm. If the firm does it in a very unsavory way, would that not be a contravention with the principle of professional behavior? Maybe there are independence issues, and independence issues are usually big factors when it comes to preliminary engagement activities, because, hey, maybe you have an audit firm, you're friends with the CEO, CFO, or anyone in upper management, and you're like, okay, yeah, we'll appoint you, and now suddenly your independence is compromised. Do you see where ethics are relevant? And you will see things like this, So scrutinize your information, because I can guarantee you there would be, an ethical issues that you need to consider. There's always something ethically which you do need to consider. Right. And another thing is a legal vacancy. Right. So a legal vacancy, obviously, if there is an auditor, you can't be appointed as an auditor also. I mean, really. So if you are auditor A, you're not gonna get auditor B coming and bam, and you're an audit, you find auditor B rocking up there, and you guys are suddenly auditing together. Unless you're joint auditors and there has been some arrangement with regards to that, you're not gonna get it. You will be the auditor. You're not gonna have two auditors. So make sure that there is a legal vacancy. If a legal vacancy does not exist, obviously you cannot accept the engagement. So make sure that you've seen whether a legal vacancy exists or not. Right? That's something which you need to consider. And lastly, agreeing the terms of the engagement, right? So this is where the engagement letter comes in. And the engagement letter, whereby